Hello, my dear friends. Introduction to the story of Hammurabi. In the heart of ancient Mesopotamia, where the Tigris and Euphrates rivers nourished the land and supported the rise of the first great civilizations, there ruled a king whose influence would echo through centuries. This king was Hammurabi, the sixth ruler of the Babylonian dynasty, who reigned from around 1792 BCE to 1750 BCE. Hammurabi is most famous not for his military conquests or wealth, but for his creation of one of the world's earliest and most influential legal systems, the Code of Hammurabi. Carved into a massive stone stele, Hammurabi's Code is one of the earliest written records of law and justice in human history. Unlike the oral traditions of law that preceded him, Hammurabi's laws were written down, accessible to all, and designed to hold the powerful and the weak alike accountable. His an eye for an eye principle, the foundation of much of his legal thinking, helped establish the idea of proportional justice, though it also revealed the harsh realities of ancient law, where penalties were often brutal and heavily influenced by social status. Though Hammurabi's empire has long since fallen, his influence remains alive today, woven into the fabric of modern legal systems. From criminal law to trade agreements and human rights, his laws laid the groundwork for systems of justice that would develop over millennia. But Hammurabi's legacy is not without its complexities. His laws reflect a society that was deeply unequal, where justice was meted out based on social class. His contributions raise questions that still resonate. What is the role of law in society? How do we balance fairness with control? This story of Hammurabi is not only the story of a king and his laws, but also a reflection on the ongoing evolution of justice, an idea that has shaped civilizations, inspired legal theorists, and influenced societies from ancient Babylon to today's globalized world. Long before the rise of classical Greece or imperial Rome, when human civilization was still learning how to organize cities, laws, and power, there existed a land shaped by two mighty rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates. This land was Mesopotamia, often called the cradle of civilization. It was here that agriculture flourished, writing was invented, and the earliest cities were built. Among these cities stood Babylon, a place that would one day become synonymous with law, order, and royal authority. At the heart of Babylon's rise stood a man whose name would echo through thousands of years of history, Hammurabi. Hammurabi was born into a world of constant uncertainty. Mesopotamia in the early second millennium BCE was not a unified empire, but a patchwork of rival city-states, each competing for land, water, trade routes, and political dominance. Cities such as Larsa, Eshnunna, Mari, and Assur all sought supremacy, while alliances shifted frequently and wars erupted without warning. Life for ordinary people depended heavily on the stability of their rulers, yet stability was rare. It was into this fragmented and volatile environment that Hammurabi emerged, destined to change the political and moral landscape of the ancient world. When Hammurabi ascended the throne of Babylon around 1792 BCE, he inherited a relatively modest kingdom. Babylon was important, but it was not yet the dominant power in Mesopotamia. Larger and stronger neighbors surrounded it, and Babylon's survival depended on careful diplomacy as much as military strength. Hammurabi understood this reality from the beginning. Unlike rulers who relied solely on brute force, he showed patience, intelligence, and a long-term vision. His early reign focused not on expansion, but on consolidation, strengthening Babylon internally before challenging external threats. Hammurabi devoted considerable attention to administration. He repaired canals, improved irrigation systems, and ensured that farmland received sufficient water, which was essential in a land where agriculture depended entirely on river management. These efforts helped stabilize food production and improved the lives of farmers, who formed the backbone of Babylonian society. By ensuring agricultural prosperity, Hammurabi secured loyalty from the population and laid the economic foundation for future expansion. This practical concern for everyday life would later be reflected in the laws he created. Religion also played a central role in Hammurabi's rule. In Mesopotamian belief, kings ruled by divine authority, acting as intermediaries between the gods and the people. Hammurabi carefully cultivated this image. He presented himself as a ruler chosen by the gods to bring justice, order, and harmony to the land. Rather than portraying himself merely as a conqueror, he emphasized his role as a protector of the weak and a guardian of moral balance. This religious legitimacy strengthened his political power and helped unify diverse populations under his rule. As Hammurabi's confidence grew, so did his ambition. Through a combination of alliances, strategic marriages, and calculated military campaigns, he gradually weakened rival city-states. He did not rush into wars unnecessarily. Instead, he waited for moments when his enemies were vulnerable, divided by internal conflict or weakened by previous battles. When the time was right, Hammurabi acted decisively. Over the course of several decades, Babylon expanded its influence and absorbed neighboring territories, transforming from a small kingdom into the dominant power of Mesopotamia. Yet Hammurabi understood that conquest alone could not sustain an empire. A diverse population, drawn from different cities with their own customs and traditions, required a common system of rules. Without clear laws, disputes could easily escalate into violence, undermining stability. Hammurabi recognized that justice needed to be visible, consistent, and accessible. This insight led to his most enduring achievement, the creation of a written legal code. Before Hammurabi, laws existed largely as customs passed down orally or as royal decrees applied inconsistently. Such systems favored the powerful and left ordinary people vulnerable. Hammurabi sought to change this by recording laws in writing and displaying them publicly. His aim was not only to punish wrongdoing, but to define acceptable behavior clearly so people could understand their rights and responsibilities. In doing so, he introduced a revolutionary idea that law should be known, fixed, and applicable across society. The Code of Hammurabi was carved onto a large stone stele and placed in a public location. At the top of the stele, Hammurabi is depicted standing before Shamash, the sun god and god of justice, receiving authority to rule. This image symbolized that the laws were not merely human commands, but divinely sanctioned principles. Below this relief were inscribed 282 laws, written in cuneiform script, covering nearly every aspect of daily life. These laws addressed issues such as theft, property damage, trade agreements, wages, marriage, divorce, inheritance, and personal injury. They reflected a society deeply concerned with order and accountability. While many of the punishments appear harsh by modern standards, they were designed to deter wrongdoing and maintain balance within the community. The famous principle, often summarized as an eye for an eye, emphasized proportional justice. Punishment should match the crime, neither excessive nor arbitrary. Importantly, Hammurabi's laws recognized social hierarchy. Penalties varied depending on whether the individuals involved were nobles, commoners, or enslaved persons. This reflected the social realities of the time, yet even within this hierarchy, the existence of written laws provided a measure of protection. Judges were required to follow established rules, and false accusations or corrupt decisions could themselves be punished. In this way, the law acted as a stabilizing force in an otherwise uncertain world. Hammurabi did not claim that his laws were perfect or eternal. In the prologue and epilogue of the Code, he described his mission as one given by the gods to bring justice to the land, destroy the wicked, and prevent the strong from oppressing the weak. He invited future rulers to respect and preserve these laws, while warning against altering them for selfish purposes. This appeal to moral responsibility reveals Hammurabi's understanding of leadership as more than power. It was a duty. As Babylon reached the height of its power, Hammurabi became not just a king, but a symbol of order. His empire stretched across much of Mesopotamia, uniting diverse peoples under single authority. Trade flourished, temples were strengthened, and cities prospered. For a time, Babylon stood as a beacon of stability in a region long marked by chaos. Yet even at the peak of his success, Hammurabi remained aware of the fragile nature of human achievements. Empires rise and fall, and laws endure only if people continue to respect them. His efforts to create a lasting legacy were rooted in this awareness. By embedding justice into stone, both literally and figuratively, he sought to ensure that his vision would outlive his reign. This is the first part of Hammurabi's story, a man shaped by disorder who responded with structure, a ruler who believed that strength without justice was empty, and a king who transformed Babylon into a center of law and governance. His journey from a modest throne to historical immortality had only begun, and the full impact of his ideas would continue to unfold long after his death.
As Hammurabi's laws spread across Babylon and its newly unified territories, daily life in Mesopotamia began to change in subtle yet profound ways. For the first time, people could look to a fixed set of rules rather than the unpredictable will of local officials or powerful elites. Merchants knew the penalties for dishonest trade, farmers understood their obligations to landlords, and families could settle disputes over marriage or inheritance with reference to written law. This growing sense of order strengthened Hammurabi's authority and deepened the bond between ruler and subjects. Justice under Hammurabi was not an abstract ideal. It was practical and rooted in the realities of Babylonian society. Courts operated with appointed judges who were expected to follow the written laws carefully. If a judge delivered an unjust verdict and it was later proven wrong, he could be fined or removed from office. This accountability was revolutionary for its time, signaling that even officials entrusted with power were subject to consequences. Hammurabi understood that justice must not only exist, but also be seen to exist, or else public trust would collapse. The economy of Babylon thrived under this legal stability. Trade expanded along river routes and across land paths connecting Mesopotamia with Anatolia, the Levant, and the Persian Gulf. Contracts governed loans, interest rates, and partnerships, many of which were explicitly addressed in Hammurabi's code. These legal protections encouraged commerce by reducing risk. Merchants could invest and travel, knowing that disputes would be settled according to law rather than violence. Babylon thus became a commercial hub, drawing wealth and influence from far beyond its borders. Hammurabi's concern for social balance extended into family life as well. His laws regulated marriage, divorce, and inheritance, reflecting the central role of the household in Babylonian society. Marriage contracts outlined responsibilities of husbands and wives, while inheritance laws aimed to prevent disputes among heirs. Although women's rights were limited by modern standards, Hammurabi's code still provided certain protections, such as financial security in cases of divorce or abandonment. These provisions reveal a ruler attentive not only to state power, but also to domestic stability.
Religion remained deeply intertwined with governance. Hammurabi continued to emphasize that his authority came from the gods, particularly Shamash, the god of justice. Temples were restored and enriched, serving as both religious and economic centers. Priests played important roles in education, record-keeping, and ritual life. By supporting religious institutions, Hammurabi reinforced social cohesion and legitimized his rule. The gods, the king, and the law formed a unified system that governed every aspect of life. Despite this internal success, Hammurabi's empire faced ongoing external challenges. Rival powers did not disappear simply because Babylon had grown strong. Assyria to the north, Elam to the east, and remnants of defeated city-states all posed potential threats. Hammurabi relied on diplomacy as much as military force, forging treaties when possible and waging war only when necessary. His correspondence, preserved on clay tablets, shows a ruler deeply involved in strategic decision-making, aware that one misstep could destabilize the empire he had built. As Hammurabi aged, the burdens of leadership increased. Maintaining unity across a vast and diverse territory required constant attention. Governors had to be monitored, rebellions suppressed, and resources allocated wisely. Hammurabi's letters reveal moments of frustration, concern, and urgency, reminding us that even legendary rulers were human, struggling with the limits of control. Yet his commitment to order never wavered. Even in difficult times, he returned to the principles of law and justice as the foundation of stability. Toward the later years of his reign, Hammurabi focused increasingly on securing his legacy. He understood that power was temporary, but ideas could endure. The public display of his law code was a deliberate act of memory-making, ensuring that future generations would associate his name with justice rather than conquest alone. He wanted to be remembered as a king who cared for his people, who brought light to a land long troubled by conflict. After Hammurabi's death around 1750 BCE, his empire did not remain united for long. Successors lacked his political skill and authority, and external pressures gradually eroded Babylon's dominance. Territories broke away, and rival powers regained strength. Yet even as the empire declined, Hammurabi's laws continued to influence legal thought. Copies of the code were made, studied, and adapted by later civilizations, spreading his ideas far beyond Babylon. Centuries later, the stone stele bearing Hammurabi's laws was discovered by archaeologists, allowing the modern world to hear his voice across time. The laws may seem severe, even brutal, to contemporary readers, but they represent a crucial step in humanity's journey toward organized society. Hammurabi showed that governance could be based on rules rather than fear, on justice rather than whim. In reflecting on Hammurabi's life, it becomes clear that his greatest achievement was not the empire he built, but the system he envisioned. He believed that society could function only when individuals understood their place within a moral and legal order. By committing that order to writing, he transformed the nature of authority itself. Kings were no longer merely warriors or priests, they were guardians of law.
As the final decades of Hammurabi's reign unfolded, Babylon stood at the height of its power. Yet beneath this appearance of strength lay deep challenges that tested the endurance of his vision. An empire built through careful planning and relentless discipline now had to be maintained across vast distances, diverse cultures, and shifting loyalties. Hammurabi knew that conquest was only the beginning. The real challenge of kingship was preservation. His later years reveal a ruler increasingly concerned with continuity, order, and the fragile nature of human achievement. The administration of the Babylonian Empire required a delicate balance between central authority and local governance.
Hammurabi appointed governors and officials to oversee distant regions, but he never fully trusted them to rule independently. Letters written by the king show that he demanded detailed reports on agriculture, taxation, military readiness, and legal disputes. Nothing was too small to escape his attention. A broken canal, a delayed shipment of grain, or an unjust verdict in a provincial court could all provoke royal intervention. This constant supervision was exhausting, but Hammurabi believed that neglect was the enemy of justice. Law remained the cornerstone of his authority. Even late in life, Hammurabi continued to issue rulings and clarifications, reinforcing the idea that the king himself was the supreme judge. Yet he did not rule by impulse. His decisions consistently referenced established laws, demonstrating that power must operate within limits. In doing so, Hammurabi elevated law above personality. The kingdom did not function because Hammurabi was strong. It functioned because rules were stable. This distinction would become one of his most profound contributions to political thought. However, the empire was not immune to strain. Maintaining armies, supporting temples, and sustaining infrastructure required heavy taxation. While laws regulated these demands, ordinary people often felt the burden. Farmers struggled during years of poor harvests, merchants faced risks from banditry and political unrest, and border regions remained vulnerable to invasion. Hammurabi responded with a mixture of firmness and mercy. In times of crisis, he occasionally canceled debts or reduced obligations, recognizing that strict enforcement without compassion could lead to rebellion. Foreign threats also loomed large. Although Hammurabi had defeated many rivals earlier in his reign, power vacuums invited new enemies. The Kassites, Assyrians, and Elamites watched Babylon closely, waiting for weakness. Hammurabi's diplomacy became more cautious, his military campaigns more defensive. Rather than expanding further, he focused on securing borders and reinforcing alliances. This shift reflected a ruler who understood the limits of expansion and the cost of overreach. As Hammurabi aged, the question of succession grew increasingly urgent. Mesopotamian history was filled with examples of strong kings followed by weak heirs, leading to rapid decline. Hammurabi attempted to prepare his successor by emphasizing continuity of law and administration. The legal code itself can be seen as part of this preparation, a guide not only for subjects but for future rulers. By embedding justice into stone, Hammurabi sought to bind his successors to the same principles, even if they lacked his skill. Death eventually came, as it does to all rulers, regardless of power or wisdom. When Hammurabi died around 1750 BCE, the empire he left behind was strong on the surface but vulnerable underneath. His son and successors inherited a vast territory but lacked Hammurabi's authority and strategic insight. Gradually, provinces broke away, external enemies advanced, and Babylon's dominance faded. Within a few generations, the empire Hammurabi had built was no more. Yet the decline of his empire did not erase his influence. Long after Babylon's political power waned, Hammurabi's laws continued to shape how people understood justice and governance. Copies of the code were studied by scribes, adapted by later rulers, and echoed in legal traditions across the ancient Near East. His insistence on written law influenced civilizations that followed, including the Assyrians, Hittites, and even distant cultures that never knew Babylon directly. In the modern world, Hammurabi's legacy gained new life when archaeologists uncovered the stone stele bearing his laws. For the first time in thousands of years, humanity could read his words again. Scholars debated their meaning, philosophers reflected on their implications, and historians recognized Hammurabi as a pioneer of legal thought. Although many of his laws conflict with modern values, the underlying principle, that society requires clear, public, and consistent rules remains fundamental. Hammurabi's story forces us to confront difficult questions. Can justice ever be truly fair in a society divided by class? Can law restrain power, or does it merely reflect it? Hammurabi did not solve these problems, but he confronted them openly. By acknowledging inequality within the law while still enforcing structure, he revealed both the possibilities and limitations of early legal systems. His work reminds us that justice evolves, shaped by culture, economy, and moral understanding. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Hammurabi's legacy is his awareness of time. In the epilogue to his law code, he speaks directly to future generations, asking them to judge his actions and preserve his work. This self-awareness sets him apart from many rulers of antiquity. Hammurabi did not see himself merely as a king of his era, but as a participant in a longer human story. He understood that memory, not power, is the true measure of greatness. In this sense, Hammurabi succeeded beyond his own imagination. His empire fell, his city changed hands, and his people disappeared into history. Yet his name endured. He became a symbol of humanity's first attempt to replace chaos with order, violence with rules, and arbitrary power with written law. His story is not simply about ancient Babylon. It is about the birth of civilization's struggle to govern itself. Hammurabi's journey concludes not with triumph or tragedy alone, but with reflection. His life reminds us that laws are born from necessity, shaped by human imperfection, and sustained by collective belief. Hammurabi carved his vision into stone, but it was humanity that carried it forward. In doing so, he transformed the idea of kingship and left an imprint that still shapes how we think about justice, authority, and society today.
With the passing of Hammurabi and the gradual fading of Babylon's imperial power, his legacy entered a new and quieter phase, one no longer defined by armies or borders, but by memory, interpretation, and influence. The fall of an empire often erases its rulers from history, yet Hammurabi's ideas survived in ways that conquest alone never could. His laws, carved into stone, became a bridge between the ancient world and future civilizations, shaping how societies imagined justice long after Babylon itself ceased to rule. In the centuries following Hammurabi's death, Mesopotamia remained a crossroads of cultures and powers. New dynasties rose and fell, each inheriting fragments of Babylonian tradition. Though political authority shifted, the idea of written law endured. Later rulers borrowed Hammurabi's model, issuing their own codes to legitimize power and regulate society. These successors may not have matched Hammurabi's vision, but they recognized the authority that law conferred. To rule was no longer simply to command, it was to legislate. The spread of Hammurabi's influence was not limited to Mesopotamia alone. Legal traditions in neighboring regions reflected similar concerns with order, punishment, and proof. While these cultures developed independently, the concept of public written law became a shared foundation. Hammurabi's code did not provide direct answers for every future society, but it established a pattern, law as a visible, permanent standard rather than a flexible tool of rulers. This shift marked a turning point in human governance. Centuries later, as classical civilizations emerged, echoes of Hammurabi's principles could still be felt. The emphasis on proportional justice, contractual obligation, and accountability resonated in Greek and Roman legal thought. While these later systems were more complex and in some cases more humane, they shared Hammurabi's belief that society requires rules to function. Even when ancient laws were criticized or revised, their existence proved that humans had long struggled to balance power with fairness. In modern times, Hammurabi's rediscovery transformed him from a distant name into a tangible voice from the past. When archaeologists uncovered the law stele, scholars were confronted with a detailed snapshot of ancient life, its fears, values, and contradictions. Hammurabi's laws revealed a society deeply concerned with stability, yet constrained by hierarchy. They forced modern readers to confront uncomfortable truths. Justice has always been shaped by social inequality, and progress is rarely linear. Despite these limitations, Hammurabi's significance lies in intention as much as outcome. He sought to restrain chaos by defining boundaries. He attempted to replace personal vengeance with regulated punishment and arbitrary rule with written standards. These efforts did not eliminate injustice, but they reduced unpredictability. In a world where survival often depended on the whims of the powerful, predictability itself was a form of protection. Hammurabi's vision also challenges modern assumptions about leadership. Today, laws are often seen as products of institutions rather than individuals. In Hammurabi's time, however, the king embodied the state. His willingness to bind himself, symbolically at least, to law suggests an early recognition that authority requires legitimacy. Power without justification breeds resistance. Power grounded in justice invites obedience. This insight remains relevant in every era. The philosophical implications of Hammurabi's code extend beyond law into the nature of morality. His laws reflect a belief that morality can be structured, measured, and enforced. Wrongdoing was not merely sinful, it was disruptive to social order. Punishment restored balance. While modern ethics emphasize individual rights and intentions, Hammurabi's world emphasized collective stability. Understanding this difference helps us appreciate how moral systems evolve in response to social needs. Hammurabi's story also invites reflection on memory and permanence. By carving his laws into stone, he sought immortality. Stone resists time more effectively than oral tradition or perishable materials. Yet even stone can be buried, broken, or forgotten. Hammurabi's true permanence came not from the stele itself, but from humanity's decision to preserve it and study it. Memory, like law, survives only when people choose to uphold it. As historians examine Hammurabi's legacy, they increasingly view him not simply as a lawgiver, but as a transitional figure. He stands between tribal custom and institutional law, between divine command and human reason. His code reflects both worlds, invoking gods while addressing practical disputes. This duality makes Hammurabi's work enduringly fascinating. It reminds us that progress often emerges from compromise rather than revolution. In the end, Hammurabi's influence cannot be measured by the longevity of his empire, but by the endurance of his ideas. He demonstrated that societies could be organized through shared rules, that justice could be written rather than improvised, and that rulers could be judged by standards they themselves proclaimed. These ideas formed the backbone of modern legal thought, even when the specific laws themselves have changed. Thus moves beyond the life of Hammurabi to explore the afterlife of his ideas. His story becomes less about one man and more about humanity's ongoing struggle to define justice. Every legal system that values transparency, consistency, and accountability owes something, directly or indirectly, to the experiment Hammurabi began in ancient Babylon. As we step away from Hammurabi's world, we are left with questions rather than answers. Can law ever be neutral?
Can justice exist without equality? Hammurabi did not resolve these dilemmas, but he gave them form. By transforming justice into something written and visible, he ensured that future generations would continue the debate. In this sense, Hammurabi is not merely a figure of ancient history. He is a participant in a conversation that continues today. As history moved forward and civilizations grew more complex, the ideas first carved into stone under Hammurabi began to take on new meanings. Law was no longer seen only as a tool for control, but as a framework through which societies could negotiate fairness, responsibility, and coexistence. Hammurabi's Code, once a practical guide for Babylonian life, gradually transformed into a reference point, a reminder of where humanity's long journey toward justice had begun. One of the most striking features of Hammurabi's legacy is the comparison it invites with modern legal systems. Today, law is deeply connected to the concept of human rights, emphasizing equality before the law, personal liberty, and protection from excessive punishment. Hammurabi's world was different. His laws openly acknowledged inequality, assigning different punishments based on social class. Yet within this hierarchy, there existed a powerful and revolutionary idea. Even the strong were subject to rules. This shift from personal authority to codified standards marks the first step toward modern rule of law. Modern justice systems rely heavily on intent, evidence, and due process. Hammurabi's laws focused more on outcome than intention. If harm occurred, punishment followed, regardless of motive. This approach reflected a society concerned primarily with restoring balance rather than understanding psychology. While modern readers may find this approach harsh, it was a rational response to a world without forensic science, professional police forces, or centralized bureaucracies. Hammurabi's system prioritized clarity and deterrence over nuance, a trade-off that ensured stability in an uncertain environment. Another important contrast lies in punishment. Hammurabi's code is often remembered for its severity, physical penalties, mutilation, and death sentences. However, these punishments were not arbitrary. They were carefully defined and publicly known. In a time when vengeance cycles could tear communities apart, fixed punishments limited escalation. Modern legal systems have largely abandoned physical punishment, but the principle of proportionality remains central. In this way, Hammurabi's philosophy continues to echo through contemporary legal thought. The concept of contracts provides another powerful connection between Hammurabi's era and our own. Many laws in the Code deal with agreements between individuals, loans, wages, partnerships, and property transfers. These laws recognized trust as the foundation of economic life. By enforcing contracts, Hammurabi enabled commerce to flourish beyond local communities. Today's global economy, governed by complex legal frameworks, rests on the same basic assumption: agreements matter, and the law must protect them. Hammurabi's leadership also invites reflection. On modern democracies, lawmaking is typically separated from executive power, reducing the risk of abuse. Hammurabi combined both roles, acting as king, judge, and lawgiver. Yet he repeatedly emphasized that his authority came with obligations. His prologue and epilogue frame the laws as a service to the people, not merely a command. This idea that leaders are accountable to a higher standard remains central to modern political ethics. The limitations of Hammurabi's code are just as instructive as its achievements. Women, slaves, and lower status individuals were not equal under the law. Justice was shaped by economic and social realities rather than universal moral principles. Recognizing these flaws does not diminish Hammurabi's importance. Instead, it highlights how far humanity has traveled. Every legal reform builds upon earlier attempts, correcting injustices while preserving useful structures. Hammurabi's code represents an early, imperfect step in a long process of moral development. In the field of legal philosophy, Hammurabi occupies a unique position. He stands at the intersection of divine law and human law. His code invokes the gods as its source of authority, yet its content is intensely practical. This dual foundation reflects a transitional moment in history when societies began shifting from purely religious explanations of justice toward rational organization. Modern secular legal systems owe much to this early blending of belief and reason. Education played a crucial role in preserving Hammurabi's legacy. Scribes copied his laws as part of their training, ensuring that the code survived long after Babylon's political decline. These copies spread his influence across generations and regions. In this way, Hammurabi became not just a historical figure, but a teacher, his laws shaping how future administrators, judges, and rulers understood governance. Knowledge, more than power, became the vehicle of his immortality. The rediscovery of Hammurabi's stele in modern times reignited debates about justice, authority, and cultural relativism. Should ancient societies be judged by modern standards, or should their laws be understood within their historical context? Hammurabi's code challenges us to balance moral critique with historical empathy. It reminds us that justice is not a fixed destination, but a process shaped by time, culture, and necessity. In contemporary discussions of law and ethics, Hammurabi often appears as a symbol rather than a model. No one advocates a return to his punishments, yet his insistence on written law continues to inspire. Transparency, consistency, and accountability, values central to modern governance, were revolutionary in his time. Hammurabi showed that law could be a public promise, binding ruler and ruled alike. As Ferdi closes, Hammurabi's story reaches beyond ancient Babylon into the modern world. His life and laws invite us to reflect on our own legal systems, to question their fairness, and to recognize their historical roots. Hammurabi did not create justice as we know it today, but he helped humanity imagine that justice could be structured, recorded, and shared. That imagination continues to shape societies thousands of years later.
As humanity entered new eras of political thought, Hammurabi's legacy began to be viewed not only as history, but as a mirror against which modern ideas of justice and governance could be measured. His code, born in an age of kings and gods, now stands in dialogue with constitutions, courts, and human rights frameworks. Part 6 explores this dialogue, how Hammurabi's ancient vision compares with modern law, and what this comparison reveals about the evolution of justice. Modern legal systems are built upon constitutions, written documents that define the powers of government and protect the rights of citizens. In many ways, Hammurabi's code can be seen as an early ancestor of constitutional thinking. Like a constitution, it was written, public, and intended to bind authority to a known standard. Unlike modern constitutions, however, Hammurabi's code did not limit royal power through separation of powers or democratic consent. The king remained the source of law. Yet the act of writing law and displaying it publicly marked a profound step toward limiting arbitrariness. One of the most striking differences between Hammurabi's system and modern law is the concept of equality before the law. Contemporary legal systems aspire, at least in principle, to treat all individuals equally, regardless of wealth, status, or background. Hammurabi's code did the opposite, explicitly distinguishing between social classes. Punishments varied for nobles, commoners, and enslaved people. This inequality reflects the social structure of ancient Mesopotamia, where hierarchy was considered natural and divinely ordained. The modern rejection of such hierarchy highlights how moral values have shifted over time. Yet even within this inequality, Hammurabi introduced a crucial idea: predictability. People knew in advance what the law required and what punishment followed wrongdoing. Modern law still values this principle, often described as legal certainty.
Citizens must be able to foresee the legal consequences of their actions. In this sense, Hammurabi's code aligns closely with modern jurisprudence, showing that predictability is a timeless requirement of justice. Human rights, as understood today, were absent from Hammurabi's world. Concepts such as freedom of expression, bodily autonomy, and equal protection under the law emerged much later. However, Hammurabi's code did protect certain interests that resemble early rights: property rights, contractual rights, and familial protections. These were not framed as inherent human rights, but as legal guarantees essential to social order. The transition from protected interests to universal rights represents one of the most significant developments in legal history. Another major contrast lies in the purpose of punishment. Modern criminal justice systems increasingly emphasize rehabilitation, proportionality, and procedural fairness. Hammurabi's punishments focused on deterrence and retribution. Physical penalties were intended to send clear messages to society. While modern ethics largely reject such punishments, the underlying goal, maintaining order and discouraging harm, remains consistent. The difference lies in method, not purpose. Evidence and procedure also mark a point of divergence. Contemporary courts rely on detailed procedures, standards of proof, and rights of the accused. Hammurabi's code addressed evidence in simpler terms, often relying on witnesses, oaths, or ordeals. These methods reflected the technological and cultural limits of the time. Still, the recognition that disputes required proof and formal judgment rather than private vengeance was a critical advancement. The role of the judge further illustrates this evolution. In Hammurabi's Babylon, judges were accountable to the law and could be punished for wrongful decisions. This principle resonates strongly with modern judicial accountability. While today's judges operate independently of political rulers, the expectation that they apply law faithfully rather than personally can be traced back to Hammurabi's insistence on consistency. Modern constitutional systems also emphasize the separation of powers, dividing authority among legislative, executive, and judicial branches to prevent abuse. Hammurabi's system concentrated these powers in the king, yet by codifying law, he created a conceptual separation between rule and ruler. The law existed independently, even if enforced by the king. This conceptual separation laid groundwork for later institutional separations. Cultural context plays a vital role in understanding these differences. Hammurabi ruled a society without representative institutions, mass education, and modern communication. Law had to be simple, direct, and authoritative. Modern societies, by contrast, can sustain complex legal systems because they possess the infrastructure to support them. Comparing Hammurabi to modern law reminds us that justice must be adapted to social conditions. In legal education today, Hammurabi's code is often taught not as a template, but as a milestone. It represents the moment when law became an object of reflection, a thing that could be written, studied, criticized, and improved. This reflective quality is essential to modern legal reform. Laws are no longer sacred commands, but human constructs, open to revision. Hammurabi's continued relevance also raises questions about cultural relativism. Should ancient laws be judged by modern moral standards, or should they be understood within their historical context? The most balanced approach recognizes both. We can acknowledge the cruelty and inequality of Hammurabi's punishments while appreciating the courage and innovation involved in creating a written legal system. Progress does not erase the past, it grows from it. In comparing Hammurabi's code with modern constitutions and human rights frameworks, one truth becomes clear. Justice is not static. It evolves through experimentation, failure, and reform. Hammurabi's Babylon was one such experiment, imperfect, hierarchical, and harsh, yet visionary in its commitment to order through law.
Long after the armies of Babylon had vanished and its walls had crumbled into dust, Hammurabi continued to live on. not as a ruler of land, but as a ruler of memory. His presence survived in classrooms, libraries, museums, and conversations about law and justice. Part 7 explores how Hammurabi moved from history into education, culture, and popular memory, becoming a symbol that transcended his own time. In ancient Mesopotamia itself, Hammurabi's legacy was preserved first through education. Scribal schools played a central role in transmitting knowledge across generations. Young scribes learned to read and write cuneiform by copying important texts, and among these texts were legal codes inspired by Hammurabi's model. Even when later kings issued new laws, the structure and language of Hammurabi's code remained influential. In this way, Hammurabi became part of the intellectual foundation of governance, shaping how future administrators understood order and responsibility. As civilizations evolved, Hammurabi's image slowly transformed. He was no longer remembered primarily as a conqueror, but as a lawgiver. This shift is significant. Many ancient rulers are remembered only for their wars, but Hammurabi's name became inseparable from justice. This transformation shows how societies choose what to remember. Power fades quickly, but ideas, especially ideas that organize social life, endure. Hammurabi's reputation thus grew stronger with time rather than weaker. In the modern era, Hammurabi entered global consciousness through archaeology and scholarship. When his law stele was rediscovered and studied, it captured the imagination of historians, legal scholars, and the public alike. Textbooks began to present Hammurabi as the earliest great lawgiver, often placing him at the beginning of legal history courses. For students encountering the idea of law for the first time, Hammurabi became a starting point, a reminder that justice has a long and complex past. In legal education, Hammurabi occupies a symbolic position. He represents the moment when law became explicit and permanent. Professors use his code to illustrate foundational concepts such as codification, proportional punishment, and legal certainty. At the same time, they encourage critical discussion of its inequalities and harshness. Hammurabi's laws thus serve a dual purpose. They teach the origins of legal structure and invite debate about moral progress. In this way, Hammurabi remains intellectually alive. Beyond classrooms, Hammurabi has also entered cultural imagination. Museums display replicas of his stele, presenting him as a figure of authority and wisdom. Artists and writers reference him when exploring themes of justice, power, and morality. In popular media, Hammurabi is often portrayed as stern, wise, and uncompromising, a symbol of ancient order. While such portrayals simplify his complexity, they reflect humanity's enduring fascination with the origins of law. Hammurabi's influence extends even into political symbolism. In some courthouses and institutions, images or references to Hammurabi appear alongside later lawgivers. He stands among figures who shaped humanity's legal consciousness, representing the ancient roots of modern systems. This symbolic presence does not mean endorsement of his laws, but recognition of his role in beginning a tradition of codified justice. His image reminds observers that law did not emerge suddenly. It was built slowly across centuries. Public memory, however, is selective. Hammurabi is often remembered for the phrase, "an eye for an eye," even though this phrase captures only a small portion of his legal philosophy. This selective memory reveals how complex ideas are reduced into symbols that are easy to remember. Yet even this simplification carries meaning. It emphasizes proportionality and fairness, core principles that still resonate today. Hammurabi's challenge is not that he is misunderstood, but that he is remembered at all, a fate many rulers never achieve. In cultural debates about punishment and justice, Hammurabi is sometimes invoked as a contrast to modern values. Critics point to his harsh penalties as evidence of humanity's violent past, while others argue that his laws were progressive for their time. Both views are valid, and together they enrich our understanding. Hammurabi's code becomes a mirror, reflecting both how far we have come and how deeply rooted our legal instincts are. Hammurabi's presence in popular memory also raises questions about heroism. Should he be admired, criticized, or simply studied? The answer lies in balance. Hammurabi was not a moral hero by modern standards, nor was he a tyrant without vision. He was a product of his time who pushed the boundaries of what governance could be. Remembering him honestly means acknowledging both his achievements and his limitations. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Hammurabi's afterlife is his continued relevance. Thousands of years after his death, people still debate his laws, quote his principles, and analyze his intentions. This endurance suggests that Hammurabi tapped into something fundamental about human society: the need for structure, predictability, and shared rules. Even when societies reject his methods, they embrace the problem he tried to solve.
Turns inward, examining the moral heart of Hammurabi's legacy. Was Hammurabi a champion of justice or an architect of cruelty? The question has followed his name across centuries, inviting admiration and discomfort in equal measure. To answer it, we must step into the moral universe of ancient Mesopotamia, one shaped by survival, hierarchy, and the ever-present fear of disorder, and ask how justice was understood when civilization itself was still fragile. In Hammurabi's time, morality was inseparable from stability. Cities depended on irrigation, trade, and cooperation. Any breakdown could lead to famine or violence. Justice, therefore, was less about individual rights and more about maintaining balance within the community. A wrong was not merely a personal offense, it was a threat to social order. Hammurabi's laws reflect this worldview. They were designed to prevent chaos by responding swiftly and decisively to wrongdoing, even when the response appears harsh by modern standards. The most famous moral symbol associated with Hammurabi is the principle often summarized as an eye for an eye. This phrase has become synonymous with revenge, yet in its original context it represented restraint. In a world where feuds could spiral endlessly, proportional punishment set limits. It declared that retaliation must not exceed the harm done. While modern ethics reject physical retribution, the underlying aim, preventing escalation, reveals a concern for social peace rather than cruelty for its own sake. Yet it would be dishonest to deny the severity of Hammurabi's punishments. Mutilation, death sentences, and collective responsibility were real features of his code. From a contemporary perspective grounded in human rights and dignity, these punishments are deeply troubling. They remind us that early legal systems often prioritized deterrence over compassion. Pain was a language understood by all, and fear was a tool of governance. Hammurabi's moral world accepted these realities as necessary, not virtuous. Class-based justice further complicates Hammurabi's moral legacy. His laws openly valued lives differently based on social status. A crime against a noble could be punished more severely than the same crime against a commoner or enslaved person. This inequality clashes sharply with modern moral commitments to equality. Yet within Hammurabi's society, hierarchy was seen as natural and divinely sanctioned. Justice was not about sameness, but about preserving a structured order believed to reflect cosmic balance. Despite these inequalities, Hammurabi's code also reveals moments of moral concern that resonate today. Laws protected widows, orphans, and debtors from complete exploitation. Judges could be punished for corruption. Builders were held accountable for unsafe construction. These provisions suggest a ruler attentive to harm and responsibility.
Hammurabi did not merely punish wrongdoing, he sought to prevent it by assigning clear duties and consequences. Moral intention matters when evaluating historical figures. Hammurabi presented himself as a king chosen to protect the weak from the strong. While his actions did not always achieve this ideal, the aspiration itself was significant. By articulating justice as a royal duty, Hammurabi shifted moral expectations of leadership. Kings were no longer judged solely by conquest or wealth, but by their ability to maintain fairness. This redefinition of moral authority left a lasting imprint on political thought. Comparing Hammurabi's morality with modern ethics highlights how moral systems evolve. Today, justice emphasizes rehabilitation, equality, and human dignity, values shaped by centuries of philosophical debate, religious reform, and social struggle. Hammurabi's world lacked these frameworks. Judging him solely by modern standards risks misunderstanding the constraints and fears of his time. Moral progress does not emerge fully formed. It develops through imperfect experiments like Hammurabi's Code. Hammurabi's morality also raises questions about the relationship between law and ethics. Are laws meant to reflect moral ideals or simply to regulate behavior? In Hammurabi's system, law leaned toward regulation. Morality was embedded in outcomes rather than intentions. Modern systems attempt to integrate both, considering motive, context, and consequence. This shift reflects changes in how societies understand responsibility and personhood. The tension between justice and cruelty in Hammurabi's legacy mirrors a broader human dilemma. Order often demands sacrifice, and early societies paid a high moral price for stability. Hammurabi's laws can thus be read as a record of humanity's struggle to govern itself under extreme conditions. They reveal the cost of early order and the seeds of later compassion. Without such early structures, later moral advancements might never have been possible. In literature and philosophy, Hammurabi often appears as a cautionary figure, a reminder that law without empathy can become oppressive. Yet he also appears as a pioneer who dared to imagine justice as something fixed and knowable. These dual images coexist because Hammurabi embodies transition. He stands between vengeance and justice, fear and order, cruelty and care. His moral ambiguity is precisely what makes him enduringly relevant.
Bringing Hammurabi decisively into the present, asking a question that feels increasingly urgent in the modern world. What relevance can an ancient Babylonian king possibly have in the 21st century? At first glance, the distance seems too great. Our world is shaped by constitutions, human rights declarations, digital technology, and global institutions. Hammurabi ruled a river-based agrarian society nearly 4,000 years ago. Yet when we look closely, his ideas continue to surface, sometimes quietly, sometimes forcefully, in contemporary debates about law, authority, punishment, and social order. In the modern age, law is often understood as a neutral system administered by institutions rather than individuals. Yet this assumption rests on foundations laid long ago. Hammurabi's greatest contribution was not the content of his laws, but the concept of codification, the belief that law should be written, public, and stable. Today, when citizens demand transparency from governments, they echo Hammurabi's insistence that rules must be visible. Hidden law breeds fear and abuse. Written law invites scrutiny. This principle remains as relevant now as it was in ancient Babylon. The 21st century has witnessed renewed concern about the rule of law. Around the world, debates rage over judicial independence, executive overreach, and the politicization of justice. In these debates, Hammurabi stands as a reminder that the struggle to bind power with rules is ancient. He ruled as a king with immense authority, yet he chose to present himself as subject to law, at least symbolically. This gesture, placing rules above personal will, lies at the heart of modern constitutionalism, even when it is imperfectly realized. Punishment remains one of the most contested areas of modern justice, and here Hammurabi's relevance becomes uncomfortable but instructive. His code embraced harsh penalties as tools of deterrence. Modern societies largely reject such measures, favoring rehabilitation and human dignity. Yet debates over capital punishment, mandatory sentencing, and public shaming show that the tension between deterrence and compassion has not disappeared. Hammurabi reminds us that punishment has always been a moral dilemma, shaped by fear, values, and social priorities rather than simple logic. Economic life in the modern world also reveals Hammurabi's enduring influence. Contracts, wages, loans, and liability are central to contemporary economies, from local markets to global corporations. Hammurabi's code devoted significant attention to these matters, recognizing that economic trust is essential for social stability. When modern courts enforce contracts or hold corporations accountable for negligence, they operate within a tradition that Hammurabi helped initiate: law as the guardian of economic relationships. Technology has transformed society in ways Hammurabi could never have imagined, yet the legal questions it raises feel surprisingly familiar. Issues such as responsibility for harm, accountability of builders or designers, and the consequences of negligence echo themes found in Hammurabi's laws. Whether dealing with collapsing buildings in ancient Babylon or failing digital systems today, societies ask the same question: who is responsible when things go wrong? Hammurabi's insistence on accountability remains deeply relevant in an age of complex systems and diffuse responsibility. Human rights discourse presents perhaps the sharpest contrast with Hammurabi's worldview. Modern ethics emphasize equality, bodily integrity, and individual freedom, values largely absent from his code. Yet the very existence of human rights frameworks reflects an evolution that began with early attempts to define justice systematically. Hammurabi did not speak the language of rights, but he helped create the conditions under which such language could emerge. Without early legal order, later moral expansion would have lacked structure. In education, Hammurabi continues to function as a starting point. Law students across the world encounter his code as the first chapter in legal history. This pedagogical role is not accidental. Hammurabi forces students to confront the origins of law before ideals softened its edges. He teaches that justice did not begin as humane or equal, but as necessary. Understanding this origin encourages humility and vigilance, reminding future lawyers and policymakers that legal systems must be constantly examined and improved. Hammurabi's relevance also appears in public discourse about authority. In times of crisis, war, pandemics, economic collapse, societies often tolerate stronger enforcement and reduced freedoms. Hammurabi's world was one of permanent crisis, where survival depended on order. Studying his system helps modern societies recognize the risks of prioritizing stability at the expense of dignity. He becomes a cautionary figure, illustrating both the power and danger of law as an instrument of control. Cultural memory in the 21st century often simplifies Hammurabi into a symbol: the stern lawgiver, the offer of eye for an eye. Yet deeper engagement reveals a more complex figure, one struggling with governance, legitimacy, and moral responsibility. This complexity resonates today, as leaders worldwide face scrutiny not only for outcomes, but for the principles guiding their decisions. Hammurabi's self-presentation as a protector of the weak, even if imperfectly realized, mirrors modern expectations of ethical leadership. Globalization adds another layer to Hammurabi's relevance. Ancient Mesopotamia was a crossroads of cultures, languages, and economies, much like today's interconnected world. Hammurabi governed diversity through uniform law, seeking coherence across differences. Modern states grapple with similar challenges: how to apply common rules fairly across varied populations. Hammurabi's experience reminds us that legal unity can foster stability, but must be balanced with sensitivity to difference.
In education, Hammurabi continues to function as a starting point. Law students across the world encounter his code as the first chapter in legal history. This pedagogical role is not accidental. Hammurabi forces students to confront the origins of law before ideals softened its edges. He teaches that justice did not begin as humane or equal, but as necessary. Understanding this origin encourages humility and vigilance, reminding future lawyers and policymakers that legal systems must be constantly examined and improved. Hammurabi's relevance also appears in public discourse about authority. In times of crisis, war, pandemics, economic collapse, societies often tolerate stronger enforcement and reduced freedoms. Hammurabi's world was one of permanent crisis, where survival depended on order. Studying his system helps modern societies recognize the risks of prioritizing stability at the expense of dignity. He becomes a cautionary figure, illustrating both the power and danger of law as an instrument of control. Cultural memory in the 21st century often simplifies Hammurabi into a symbol, the stern lawgiver, the author of Eye for an Eye. Yet deeper engagement reveals a more complex figure, one struggling with governance, legitimacy, and moral responsibility. This complexity resonates today as leaders worldwide face scrutiny not only for outcomes, but for the principles guiding their decisions. Hammurabi's self-presentation as a protector of the weak, even if imperfectly realized, mirrors modern expectations of ethical leadership. Globalization adds another layer to Hammurabi's relevance. Ancient Mesopotamia was a crossroads of cultures, languages, and economies, much like today's interconnected world. Hammurabi governed diversity through uniform law, seeking coherence across differences. Modern states grapple with similar challenges: how to apply common rules fairly across varied populations. Hammurabi's experience reminds us that legal unity can foster stability, but must be balanced with sensitivity to difference. In philosophy and ethics, Hammurabi contributes to ongoing debates about moral relativism. Can justice be judged outside its historical context? Hammurabi's laws challenge modern thinkers to navigate between condemnation and understanding. His relevance lies not in imitation, but in dialogue. By engaging with his ideas, modern societies sharpen their own values, clarifying what they accept, reject, and aspire to become.
Brings the long journey of Hammurabi's story to its conclusion, not by ending it, but by gathering its many threads into a single reflection on law, power, memory, and humanity. Hammurabi began as a historical king in ancient Babylon, yet across these chapters he is transformed into something far larger, a symbol of civilization's first serious attempt to replace chaos with order. His story is not only about what he achieved, but about what humanity learned and continues to learn from his experiment with justice. At the center of Hammurabi's legacy lies a simple but revolutionary insight: rules must outlast rulers. In a world where authority was often personal and unpredictable, Hammurabi carved law into stone so that it would remain visible even when the king was absent. This act alone separates him from countless rulers whose power vanished with their death. Hammurabi understood, perhaps instinctively, that civilization depends on continuity. Laws give societies memory. They allow values to persist beyond individual lives. Throughout his reign, Hammurabi balanced three forces that have always shaped governance: fear, faith, and fairness. Fear maintained order, faith legitimized authority, and fairness, however limited, provided moral grounding. Modern societies still navigate these same forces, though in different forms. Police, courts, constitutions, and public opinion now play roles once held by divine mandate and royal decree. Hammurabi's system reminds us that these forces must remain in tension. When fear dominates, justice becomes cruelty. When faith dominates, law becomes unquestionable.
When fairness dominates without structure, order collapses. One of the most enduring lessons of Hammurabi's code is that law is a human construction. Although he invoked the gods, the content of his laws addressed practical human problems: broken contracts, unsafe buildings, unpaid wages, family disputes. This practicality reveals a crucial truth. Justice begins not in abstract ideals, but in daily life. Modern legal systems, despite their complexity, still revolve around these same human concerns. Technology has changed tools, not needs. Hammurabi's limitations are as instructive as his achievements. His laws were unequal, harsh, and deeply shaped by hierarchy. Yet these flaws do not negate his importance. They define it. Progress requires a starting point, and Hammurabi's code was one such beginning. Every later reform, Roman law, religious legal systems, modern constitutions, human rights, can be seen as a response to the same question Hammurabi faced: how can power be exercised without destroying society? In this sense, Hammurabi is not a model to follow, but a foundation to build upon. Modern law rejects his punishments, challenges his inequalities, and expands his narrow vision of justice, yet it retains his core structure: written rules, public accountability, and the idea that authority must justify itself. Civilization did not abandon Hammurabi, it grew beyond him. Hammurabi's story also teaches humility. It reminds modern societies that values we consider universal, equality, dignity, rights, are historically fragile achievements. They were not inevitable. They emerged slowly, through struggle, reflection, and correction of earlier systems. Hammurabi's world shows how easily justice can become control when survival is threatened. His code warns us that moral regression is always possible if fear replaces conscience. Memory plays a central role in Hammurabi's endurance. His empire collapsed, his language faded, and his gods lost worshippers. Yet his ideas survived because they were preserved, rediscovered, and reinterpreted. This survival highlights an often overlooked truth: history shapes the future only when it is remembered. Hammurabi's relevance today depends on our willingness to study him honestly, without worship and without dismissal. Across these 10 parts, Hammurabi has appeared as king, lawgiver, administrator, moral actor, symbol, and cautionary tale. This complexity resists simple judgment. He was neither purely just nor merely cruel. He was a ruler navigating the edge of civilization, trying to hold society together with the tools available to him. That struggle, the effort to govern responsibly under pressure, is deeply human and timeless. In the final analysis, Hammurabi's greatest legacy is not a list of laws, but a question carved into history. What do we owe one another in order to live together? His answer was shaped by fear of disorder and belief in hierarchy. Our answers today emphasize dignity and equality. Tomorrow's answers may differ again. The continuity lies not in the answers, but in the asking. As this series ends, Hammurabi remains where he has always been, at the beginning. He stands at the threshold of law, marking humanity's first deliberate step away from chaos toward structure. Every courtroom, constitution, and code that followed carries a trace of that step. To study Hammurabi is not to look backward in nostalgia, but to recognize the long path justice has traveled and the responsibility we bear to continue it.
Opens a new phase of the narrative by turning from conclusions to continuities, by asking how Hammurabi's ideas did not simply end with his era, but flowed forward, changing shape as they encountered new societies, beliefs, and institutions. Rather than treating history as a sequence of isolated chapters, this part traces a quieter movement, the transmission of legal thinking across time, carried by scribes, teachers, and traditions that outlived empires. In the centuries after Hammurabi, Mesopotamia remained a laboratory of governance. New rulers issued decrees, revised penalties, and adapted legal practices to changing conditions. Yet beneath these surface changes, the basic structure introduced by Hammurabi endured. Law remained written, judgments remained recorded, authority remained justified through reference to rules rather than impulse alone. This continuity mattered more than any single statute because it trained societies to think of justice as something external to the ruler's mood. Scribal culture played a decisive role in this process. In Mesopotamian schools, students copied legal texts as exercises in writing and reasoning. Law was not merely memorized, it was practiced as a form of disciplined thought. By learning how cases were framed and resolved, scribes internalized a method of analysis that emphasized clarity, precedent, and accountability. Hammurabi's influence thus persisted not just in content, but in habit, in how people learned to think about disputes. As these scribes traveled or were employed by new administrations, legal habits traveled with them. This quiet migration of ideas helps explain why later legal codes across the ancient Near East resemble Hammurabi's in structure, even when their values differ. The habit of codification became part of political common sense. Rulers understood that to govern effectively, they needed laws that could be cited, taught, and enforced beyond their immediate presence. Religion also adapted to this evolving legal consciousness. While Hammurabi framed his authority as divinely sanctioned, later societies began to interpret divine law in increasingly textual terms. Sacred commandments were written, preserved, and interpreted by specialists. The notion that justice could be anchored in text rather than in momentary revelation gained strength. In this way, Hammurabi's experiment influenced not only secular governments, but religious imagination as well. The spread of literacy amplified these effects. As more people encountered written law, even indirectly, expectations shifted. Communities began to demand consistency. Disputes were argued with reference to texts rather than power alone. Although access to literacy remained limited, its cultural impact was profound. Law acquired a kind of objectivity. It could be pointed to, debated, and remembered. Hammurabi's stone stele symbolized this transformation, but it was everyday practice that sustained it. Over time, the relationship between law and morality also evolved. Hammurabi's system treated morality as social balance, enforced through punishment. Later traditions introduced ideas of intention, repentance, and mercy. Yet these moral expansions did not replace law, they layered upon it. Structure came first, refinement later. Hammurabi's contribution was to provide the structure, a framework sturdy enough to support moral growth. Also invites reflection on how societies learn from past injustice. Hammurabi's inequalities became reference points for reform. Later thinkers could identify what needed to change precisely because it had been clearly defined. Vague customs are difficult to challenge. Written laws can be criticized, amended, and replaced. In this sense, Hammurabi's rigidity enabled progress. By fixing injustice in text, he made it visible. This visibility is crucial to understanding Hammurabi's enduring relevance. Modern societies continue to rely on documentation, constitutions, statutes, judgments, not because texts are perfect, but because they allow collective memory. Law without memory collapses into arbitrariness. Hammurabi grasped this intuitively. His laws were not merely commands, they were records. They told a story about how society understood itself. As history advanced, new empires rose with broader horizons and more complex institutions. Yet even as scale increased, the fundamental challenge remained the same: how to govern many people fairly and predictably. Hammurabi's answer, codify rules and bind authority to them, proved adaptable. It could be expanded, softened, or challenged, but not ignored. Societies that abandoned this principle often fell back into instability. Education remained the silent engine of this continuity. Legal reasoning became a discipline transmitted across generations. Case examples replaced myths as tools for teaching judgment. This shift marked a subtle but important change in human cognition. Problems were solved not only through storytelling or ritual, but through analysis. Hammurabi's legacy thus extends into the history of rational thought. Hammurabi, therefore, reframes Hammurabi not as an endpoint, but as a starting signal, a moment when humanity chose documentation over improvisation. His laws did not freeze justice, they set it in motion. Every later legal debate, reform, and revolution can be seen as a response to that initial decision to write rules down. As this part closes, the narrative widens. Hammurabi's stone still stands in museums, but his deeper monument exists in practice, in the expectation that power must explain itself, that disputes deserve reasoned answers, and that societies are responsible for remembering their own rules. These expectations did not emerge naturally. They were learned, slowly, through experiments like Hammurabi's.
Follows Hammurabi's ideas as they travel outward, beyond Babylon and Mesopotamia, crossing borders through trade, conquest, education, and cultural exchange. While Hammurabi never ruled lands far beyond the Euphrates, his legal imagination did. What began as a Babylonian experiment in codified justice gradually influenced neighboring civilizations, shaping a wider ancient world that learned to govern through written rules rather than custom alone. In the ancient Near East, borders were porous. Merchants moved along riverways and caravan routes. Soldiers marched across contested plains, and scribes carried tablets wherever administrations required record-keeping. Along with goods and people traveled ideas. Legal practices were among the most transferable of these ideas because they addressed universal human problems: ownership, debt, injury, marriage, and responsibility. Hammurabi's code, preserved and copied by scribes, became part of this shared intellectual currency. One of the clearest signs of Hammurabi's influence appears in later Mesopotamian legal traditions. The Assyrians, who rose to power after Babylon's decline, developed their own legal collections. While Assyrian laws were often harsher, their structure closely resembled Hammurabi's: written statutes, categorized offenses, and fixed penalties. This similarity suggests not simple imitation, but inheritance. The Assyrians accepted the idea that law must be recorded and publicly recognized, even as they adapted its content to their own values and political culture. To the northwest, the Hittite civilization provides another example of legal transmission. Hittite laws differed significantly from Hammurabi's in tone, often favoring compensation over physical punishment. Yet the very act of composing a formal law code reflects Hammurabi's legacy. The Hittites understood, as Hammurabi had, that written law stabilized authority and reduced conflict. Their modifications demonstrate an important truth. Hammurabi's influence was not rigid. It allowed variation, reform, and moral reinterpretation. Trade networks amplified these exchanges. Cities engaged in long-distance commerce required reliable systems for contracts, weights, measures, and dispute resolution. Hammurabi's emphasis on contractual clarity suited these needs perfectly. Merchants operating across regions benefited from predictable rules even when local customs differed. Over time, this preference for written agreements strengthened the authority of law across cultural boundaries, embedding Hammurabi's core insight into everyday economic life. Religion also acted as a bridge for legal ideas. Many ancient societies viewed law as divinely inspired.
Hammurabi's portrayal of receiving authority from the god Shamash resonated widely, enforcing the idea that justice was sacred. Later cultures adopted similar imagery, presenting their laws as gifts from gods. While theological details varied, the underlying message remained constant. Law was not merely human convenience, but cosmic order expressed in human form. The movement of scribes was especially important in spreading Hammurabi's influence. Trained in legal reasoning and record-keeping, scribes served kings, temples, and merchants alike. Wherever they worked, they brought methods shaped by Babylonian precedent. Over generations, this created a shared professional culture of law, one that valued written records, case analysis, and consistency. Hammurabi's code thus functioned as a template for legal thinking rather than a fixed set of commands. Beyond the Near East, Hammurabi's indirect influence becomes more subtle but still significant. While ancient Greece and Rome developed their legal systems independently, they encountered Near Eastern traditions through trade and cultural contact. The idea that law should be codified and publicly accessible emerged repeatedly, suggesting a diffusion of legal consciousness rather than direct borrowing. Hammurabi's experiment contributed to an atmosphere in which written law became imaginable and desirable. Roman law, often credited as the foundation of modern legal systems, shares Hammurabi's emphasis on codification and clarity. Although separated by centuries and cultures, both systems recognized that authority gains legitimacy through rules that can be cited and debated. Hammurabi did not shape Roman law directly, but he helped normalize the very concept of law as a written institution, an inheritance passed along a long chain of civilizations. This section also highlights the limits of influence. Hammurabi's specific laws did not become universal standards, nor did his moral assumptions spread unchanged. What traveled was the form, not the content, the belief that justice could be systematized. This distinction is crucial. It explains why later societies could reject Hammurabi's punishments while embracing his structure. Influence does not require agreement, it requires usefulness. As legal ideas crossed borders, they encountered new moral landscapes. Some societies softened punishments, others intensified them. Some expanded protections, others reinforced hierarchy. Yet all operated within a shared framework that Hammurabi helped establish. Law became something that could be written down, revised, and transmitted. Justice entered history as a conversation rather than a command. This section thus reveals Hammurabi as a connector, a figure whose ideas linked cultures across time and space. His code did not conquer through force, it persuaded through practicality. Societies adopted codified law not because Hammurabi was Babylonian, but because his solution worked. In a world of growing complexity, written rules offered stability. As this part closes, Hammurabi's influence appears less like a straight line and more like a widening circle. Each culture that encountered his legacy reshaped it, adding new values and priorities. The result was not uniformity, but continuity, a shared commitment to law as a foundation of civilization.
Brings us into the modern world, where Hammurabi's legacy reaches beyond the confines of ancient Mesopotamia and continues to influence the legal structures of contemporary societies. From academic texts to international institutions, Hammurabi's code stands as a cornerstone in the development of the rule of law, serving not only as a historical curiosity, but as a living symbol of the struggle to balance power, justice, and society. As global legal systems developed in the wake of the Enlightenment, thinkers began to recognize that the idea of written law, of codification and universal standards had roots stretching far back into history.
The influence of Hammurabi, whether directly or indirectly, was often acknowledged by historians and legal scholars who looked to ancient law codes as foundational sources for their own legal reforms. Even as nations developed their own systems of law, the concepts introduced by Hammurabi resonated in debates about justice and fairness that continue to this day. In the late 18th and early 19th centuries, as the world began to build on the intellectual framework established by thinkers like Montesquieu and Rousseau, many countries began to reimagine their own systems of justice through the lens of the rule of law. Legal codes were created, and with them the idea of codified laws, those written down, made public, and accessible to everyone, became central. This process echoes the very purpose of Hammurabi's code, to create a visible, predictable system of justice that all members of society could understand and access. In these new constitutional and legal frameworks, Hammurabi's emphasis on public visibility and transparency in law continued to resonate. Today, constitutions, bills of rights, and legal codes in many countries are still grounded in the idea that laws must be written, codified, and publicly available. Even in systems that rely heavily on common law, like in the United States and the United Kingdom, the concept of codified law, founded on the idea of creating a clear, structured legal system that is accessible to all citizens, reflects a direct line back to Hammurabi. The most famous and widely recognized influence of Hammurabi today is his impact on international human rights law. While Hammurabi's code did not embrace the concept of universal human rights, it set in motion the intellectual currents that would eventually lead to such an ideal. In his time, Hammurabi's laws represented a form of moral order designed to protect society as a whole, even if they did not treat all individuals equally. Modern human rights frameworks, on the other hand, aim to ensure equality, dignity, and individual rights for all, and these too can trace their lineage back to the seeds planted by Hammurabi's insistence on codifying justice. By the 20th century, following the horrors of the world wars and the widespread recognition of human rights violations, international institutions like the United Nations began to develop frameworks for the protection of individual rights on a global scale. Documents such as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, UDHR, adopted in 1948, represent the culmination of centuries of legal development. The UDHR, while miles apart in content from Hammurabi's code, is built upon similar principles: the protection of the individual, the right to justice, and the need for laws that transcend rulers and empires. In this way, Hammurabi's vision of law as a public, written system that served the greater social good continues to influence the structure of modern global justice systems. One of the most significant ways Hammurabi's legacy survives in modern thought is through the lens of comparative law, which seeks to understand the differences and similarities in legal systems across the world. Comparative law is often taught in law schools to encourage an understanding of how different countries and cultures have handled legal systems throughout history. Hammurabi's code, as one of the earliest known examples of codified law, is a critical starting point for this study. It serves as a baseline for comparing ancient law codes, such as those of the Greeks, Romans, and various Asian and African civilizations, to the legal structures we see today. Legal scholars and historians often draw comparisons between Hammurabi's code and more modern legal systems. For instance, the principle of proportional punishment, so clearly articulated in Hammurabi's law, is still debated today in relation to punishment theory. Scholars continue to wrestle with how much punishment is appropriate for certain crimes and what constitutes proportional justice. These conversations find their roots in the ancient debates started by Hammurabi and other early lawgivers. His recognition that punishment should be linked to the crime and not arbitrary remains a core tenet of modern jurisprudence. Hammurabi's legal framework also continues to influence criminal law and contract law. His focus on damages, property rights, and trade agreements laid the groundwork for the kind of contracts that underpin modern commerce. While modern legal systems now involve intricate details regarding intellectual property, financial transactions, and international trade agreements, the fundamental idea that contracts should be enforceable by law, made public, and written down for accountability can be traced directly back to Hammurabi's Code. Another important impact of Hammurabi's Code lies in its influence on the development of judicial accountability. Hammurabi held judges accountable for delivering fair and impartial verdicts, a principle that continues to be foundational in modern judicial ethics. Today, judges are still required to issue reasoned decisions based on the rule of law, and they are held accountable for the fairness of their judgments. Although the specifics of judicial responsibility have evolved, the general principle that justice should be fair and public remains one of the most important legacies of Hammurabi's legal reforms. Despite these enduring influences, Hammurabi's legal code has also been subject to criticism. The inequalities present in the code, such as the different treatment of nobles, commoners, and slaves, stand in sharp contrast to modern principles of equality before the law. Hammurabi's laws recognized no concept of universal human rights, and his code was often brutal, advocating for harsh penalties that modern societies would find unacceptable. However, even these flaws offer valuable lessons for modern societies. They remind us that laws must evolve in response to changing social values and evolving understandings of justice. While we have advanced far beyond Hammurabi's society, his code remains a reminder that no legal system can be static. It must always adapt to the moral and ethical progress of the people it serves. The continued study of Hammurabi's code also helps us understand the historical development of legal theory. Legal theorists have long debated the origins of law, and Hammurabi's code offers important insights into the early development of legal thought. His work is often cited as an example of positive law, where laws are enacted and enforced by a sovereign authority rather than emerging from natural law or divine will. This distinction laid the groundwork for later developments in Western legal philosophy, especially the works of philosophers like Thomas Hobbes and John Locke, who further explored the relationship between law, authority, and social order.
As we enter the final chapters of this journey through Hammurabi's legacy, it becomes clear that his influence is not something that belongs solely to the past. Hammurabi's laws were not confined to the dusty shelves of history. They continued to inspire, challenge, and provoke thought in modern legal systems. The future of Hammurabi's legacy is one that connects the ancient with the contemporary, as societies continued to grapple with the balance between order, justice, and fairness. In the 21st century, the world faces new challenges that Hammurabi could never have imagined: issues of digital privacy, artificial intelligence, global trade, and climate change. Yet the fundamental questions about law that Hammurabi addressed — how do we maintain order? How do we ensure fairness? How do we resolve disputes? — remain remarkably relevant. As the world becomes more interconnected and complex, Hammurabi's insistence on written, public law serves as a foundational principle for global governance. The idea that law must be made visible, accessible, and accountable to all remains essential as new forms of authority emerge. Modern international institutions, such as the United Nations and the International Criminal Court, are built on principles that have roots in Hammurabi's vision of codified justice. Hammurabi, though operating in an entirely different political and cultural context, believed that law was not just a tool for rulers to wield, but a public good to be shared and upheld by all members of society.
This commitment to transparency and accountability has been echoed throughout history and is now enshrined in international law. The international system's emphasis on human rights, equity, and justice for all has its intellectual roots in these early codifications of law. One of the most important modern connections to Hammurabi's code is the growing focus on human rights law. Hammurabi's laws, while not acknowledging universal human rights as we know them today, marked an early attempt to protect the weak and ensure that justice was not solely the domain of the powerful. In the 20th century, as human rights movements gained momentum, Hammurabi's vision of law as a public document was revitalized. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted by the United Nations in 1948, reflects a similar aspiration: to create a legal system that serves as a safeguard for human dignity, regardless of social class, gender, or ethnicity. In both Hammurabi's code and modern human rights law, we see an understanding that the law is not just about punishment, but about protecting people. In today's democratic societies, the power of law is constrained by checks and balances, a principle that Hammurabi would not have recognized in the same way. Hammurabi's legal authority was absolute. However, modern systems of law often limit the powers of rulers and public officials through constitutional constraints, judicial review, and the protection of civil liberties. This shift marks a significant departure from Hammurabi's monarchy, but his idea that laws must govern a society, not individuals, is still central. Hammurabi's legacy can be seen in the continued importance placed on written law and judicial accountability. As legal systems continue to evolve, technology and law present new challenges that echo Hammurabi's basic principles. For example, as the digital world expands, questions around cybersecurity, digital privacy, and intellectual property demand that new legal structures be codified and widely disseminated. Hammurabi's emphasis on creating written laws that everyone could access is reflected today in efforts to codify laws governing online behavior. Just as Hammurabi's code made law visible and consistent, modern societies are working to ensure that digital regulations are transparent and accessible to all. Similarly, the global trade law system, which governs cross-border transactions, tariffs, and international contracts, bears a direct lineage to Hammurabi's efforts to regulate commerce. Hammurabi's laws addressed property rights, business contracts, and wages, laying the groundwork for how societies still think about the intersection of law and commerce. Today, trade agreements are often codified in treaties that transcend national boundaries, providing legal clarity and predictability in a globalized market. One of the most important modern connections to Hammurabi's code is the growing focus on human rights law. Hammurabi's laws, while not acknowledging universal human rights as we know them today, marked an early attempt to protect the weak and ensure that justice was not solely the domain of the powerful. In the 20th century, as human rights movements gained momentum, Hammurabi's vision of law as a public document was revitalized. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted by the United Nations in 1948, reflects a similar aspiration: to create a legal system that serves as a safeguard for human dignity, regardless of social class, gender, or ethnicity. In both Hammurabi's code and modern human rights law, we see an understanding that the law is not just about punishment, but about protecting people. In today's democratic societies, the power of law is constrained by checks and balances, a principle that Hammurabi would not have recognized in the same way. Hammurabi's legal authority was absolute. However, modern systems of law often limit the powers of rulers and public officials through constitutional constraints, judicial review, and the protection of civil liberties. This shift marks a significant departure from Hammurabi's monarchy, but his idea that laws must govern a society, not individuals, is still central. Hammurabi's legacy can be seen in the continued importance placed on written law and judicial accountability. As legal systems continued to evolve, technology and law present new challenges that echo Hammurabi's basic principles. For example, as the digital world expands, questions around cybersecurity, digital privacy, and intellectual property demand that new legal structures be codified and widely disseminated. Hammurabi's emphasis on creating written laws that everyone could access is reflected today in efforts to codify laws governing online behavior. Just as Hammurabi's code made law visible and consistent, modern societies are working to ensure that digital regulations are transparent and accessible to all. Similarly, the global trade law system, which governs cross-border transactions, tariffs, and international contracts, bears a direct lineage to Hammurabi's efforts to regulate commerce. Hammurabi's laws addressed property rights, business contracts, and wages, laying the groundwork for how societies still think about the intersection of law and commerce. Today, trade agreements are often codified in treaties that transcend national boundaries, providing legal clarity and predictability in a globalized market. One of the most important modern connections to Hammurabi's code is the growing focus on human rights law. Hammurabi's laws, while not acknowledging universal human rights as we know them today, marked an early attempt to protect the weak and ensure that justice was not solely the domain of the powerful. In the 20th century, as human rights movements gained momentum, Hammurabi's vision of law as a public document was revitalized. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted by the United Nations in 1948, reflects a similar aspiration: to create a legal system that serves as a safeguard for human dignity, regardless of social class, gender, or ethnicity. In both Hammurabi's code and modern human rights law, we see an understanding that the law is not just about punishment, but about protecting people. In today's democratic societies, the power of law is constrained by checks and balances, a principle that Hammurabi would not have recognized in the same way. Hammurabi's legal authority was absolute. However, modern systems of law often limit the powers of rulers and public officials through constitutional constraints, judicial review, and the protection of civil liberties. This shift marks a significant departure from Hammurabi's monarchy, but his idea that laws must govern a society, not individuals, is still central. Hammurabi's legacy can be seen in the continued importance placed on written law and judicial accountability. As legal systems continued to evolve, technology and law present new challenges that echo Hammurabi's basic principles. For example, as the digital world expands, questions around cybersecurity, digital privacy, and intellectual property demand that new legal structures be codified and widely disseminated. Hammurabi's emphasis on creating written laws that everyone could access is reflected today in efforts to codify laws governing online behavior. Just as Hammurabi's code made law visible and consistent, modern societies are working to ensure that digital regulations are transparent and accessible to all. Similarly, the global trade law system, which governs cross-border transactions, tariffs, and international contracts, bears a direct lineage to Hammurabi's efforts to regulate commerce. Hammurabi's laws addressed property rights, business contracts, and wages, laying the groundwork for how societies still think about the intersection of law and commerce. Today, trade agreements are often codified in treaties that transcend national boundaries, providing legal clarity and predictability in a globalized market. One of the most important modern connections to Hammurabi's
represents the culmination of our exploration into the story of Hammurabi, his code, and his enduring influence. As we conclude this journey, it is essential to reflect on the trajectory of his legacy, not just as a king or lawgiver, but as a symbol of the complex relationship between law, power, and society. From the stone tablet he carved by the banks of the Euphrates to the modern courtrooms and international treaties of today, Hammurabi's impact reverberates far beyond his time. The legacy of codification and rule of law. At the heart of Hammurabi's legacy is his contribution to the idea of codified law. In a world where laws were often oral, subject to the whims of local rulers and changing customs, Hammurabi took a bold step. He wrote down the laws, made them public, and placed them within the reach of his people. This was not merely an act of bureaucracy, it was a philosophical statement about the nature of justice itself. By giving society clear, visible, and consistent rules, Hammurabi set a foundational precedent for the rule of law, a concept that remains the cornerstone of legal systems around the world today. In modern times, written constitutions and legal codes are the backbone of governance in nearly every country. They ensure that power is not concentrated in the hands of a few, but is instead distributed according to predictable rules. Hammurabi's recognition that law should be accessible and transparent directly influenced these modern systems. Without Hammurabi, the concept of a public written law would not have emerged in the way we understand it today. From local to global, the universalization of legal ideals. While Hammurabi's influence began in the small city of Babylon, his ideas spread beyond the borders of his empire. Neighboring civilizations, such as the Assyrians and Hittites, adapted his methods of legal codification. These ideas traveled through trade routes, military conquest, and diplomatic exchanges, reaching distant regions and influencing cultures far removed from Mesopotamia. Today, Hammurabi's influence is global, seen not just in the legal systems of individual countries, but also in international law. Modern international treaties and human rights frameworks can trace intellectual lineage back to Hammurabi's vision of written law that protected citizens, at least in part. His code laid the groundwork for the notion that law should be universal and impartially enforced. International organizations such as the United Nations and the International Criminal Court embody these principles, ensuring that the legal standards Hammurabi initiated are now extended to the global stage. Hammurabi's ideas have helped shape concepts like universal justice and human rights, emphasizing that law should be a force for protection rather than oppression. Though his laws were far from perfect, the notion that law must transcend personal rulers and be universally accessible was revolutionary. This principle continues to guide modern international efforts to establish peace, protect vulnerable populations, and promote fair governance. The evolution of punishment from retribution to rehabilitation. One of the most controversial aspects of Hammurabi's legacy is his use of punishment. The laws of Hammurabi were harsh by modern standards. Physical punishments, such as mutilation and even the death penalty, were common responses to criminal acts. However, the fundamental idea behind these punishments, proportional justice, remains relevant today. The principle of an eye for an eye was not an endorsement of revenge, but an early attempt to establish clear limits on retribution and prevent escalating violence. In modern times, the focus of criminal justice has shifted dramatically. Restorative justice and rehabilitation have become more prominent as responses to crime, emphasizing the reintegration of offenders into society rather than their punishment alone. Yet the core challenge remains the same. How do we balance the need for justice and accountability with the moral imperative to protect human dignity? Hammurabi's laws remind us that this balance is never easy, and it continues to shape debates about the purpose and nature of criminal justice systems today. Morality, inequality, and social hierarchy. Hammurabi's code is often criticized for its inequalities. It treated people differently based on social status. Nobles, commoners, and slaves received different punishments for the same crimes. These class distinctions are deeply troubling by today's standards of equality and human rights. However, these inequalities also highlight the moral evolution of legal thought over time. Modern legal systems, particularly in democratic societies, emphasize equality before the law.
the idea that all individuals, regardless of their social status, should be treated equally by the legal system. Hammurabi's code, however, reflects the hierarchical nature of ancient societies, where class divisions were seen as natural and divinely sanctioned. While we have made significant strides in recognizing the inherent dignity and equality of all individuals, Hammurabi's system still serves as a reminder of how far we have come in our understanding of justice and fairness. This evolution of legal morality is evident in the movement from natural law, which underpinned much of Hammurabi's thinking, to human rights law. While Hammurabi's laws were based on the premise of divine or natural order, modern human rights law posits that rights are inherent to all people regardless of their position in society. This shift reflects humanity's growing commitment to universal equality, a commitment Hammurabi could not have fully envisioned, but that traces its intellectual roots to his emphasis on a structured, codified system of law. Hammurabi's enduring legacy in legal philosophy. Hammurabi's influence also extends into legal philosophy. His code marks a critical turning point in the development of legal thought. For the first time, law was not based on personal whim or local custom, but on written statutes that could be interpreted, enforced, and even changed over time. This laid the groundwork for the philosophical exploration of law, from ancient thinkers like Aristotle and Cicero to modern legal theorists such as John Locke and Immanuel Kant. Hammurabi's insistence on a public, codified legal system helped shape legal positivism, which holds that laws are the products of human action, not divine will. In modern legal thought, positivism plays a significant role in understanding the nature of law and its relationship to power. By creating a legal system that was separate from the whims of kings, Hammurabi helped plant the seeds of a system where law could be a reflection of society's evolving values rather than a tool for tyrannical rulers. The continuing evolution of legal systems. In the 21st century, Hammurabi's legacy lives on in global justice systems that emphasize codification, fairness, and accountability. His idea that law must be written down, made public, and consistently applied is foundational to modern democratic legal systems. As societies continue to adapt to new challenges, whether in the realm of digital law, climate justice, or international human rights, the basic principles Hammurabi championed will continue to guide us. Today's world faces challenges that Hammurabi could not have imagined. However, his legacy provides a framework through which we can understand our modern legal struggles. As we continue to debate issues such as privacy, data protection, and global governance, we can look back to Hammurabi's simple yet profound idea: law is for the people. It is something that should serve to organize and protect, to ensure that no one is above the rules and that all have access to justice. As we close the final chapter of Hammurabi's story, we are reminded that his legacy is not one of rigid, unchangeable laws, but of progressive adaptation. From the ancient stelae in Babylon to the digital laws of the 21st century, Hammurabi's influence remains a testament to humanity's ongoing search for justice, order, and fairness in an increasingly complex world.
The influence of Hammurabi's code is still visible in the legal systems of today. Modern legal systems around the world have learned much from his code, particularly in the areas of written law and the idea of equality before the law. The foundation Hammurabi laid for making law visible and accessible to all members of society continues to shape contemporary justice systems, ensuring that laws are not arbitrary but consistent and public. Today, international human rights law, democratic constitutions, and commercial contracts all owe a great deal to Hammurabi's approach to law. The way he codified his laws and ensured they were accessible to the people laid the groundwork for the principle that law must be written, transparent, and fair to all. This idea is still crucial to the functioning of modern judicial systems and is reflected in international treaties that govern human rights and trade.
Modern international institutions, such as the United Nations and the International Criminal Court, are built on principles that echo Hammurabi's vision of codified justice. While Hammurabi's laws were specific to his time and society, the idea that law should be accessible, impartial, and accountable to all citizens remains fundamental in global legal systems. Additionally, the influence of Hammurabi's principles can be seen in the ongoing evolution of criminal law. Today, criminal justice systems continue to wrestle with issues of proportional punishment, fair trial rights, and equal protection under the law, all of which can be traced back to the basic principles Hammurabi embedded in his legal system. While his punishments were often harsh by modern standards, his core idea that crimes should be addressed in a structured, public way has had a lasting impact on the way societies approach justice. As we advance into the complexities of the 21st century, the challenges that society faces today are vastly different from those Hammurabi encountered. Issues such as digital privacy, climate change, artificial intelligence, and global trade demand new legal frameworks that Hammurabi could never have imagined. Yet, his foundational contributions to written law, public accessibility, and proportional justice remain deeply relevant in these modern contexts. Legal responses to digital privacy and cybersecurity. With the rise of the Internet, digital privacy laws have become a focal point of contemporary legal debates. Just as Hammurabi sought to protect the rights and property of his people, modern legal systems now face the challenge of defining and protecting digital rights, such as the right to privacy and data protection. Hammurabi's emphasis on written law as a safeguard for society is mirrored in the way cybersecurity laws and data protection regulations have been codified to protect personal information in today's digital world. His early belief that law must be transparent and accessible is essential to understanding modern regulations like GDPR, General Data Protection Regulation, which aims to hold corporations accountable for the data they collect from individuals. Climate change and environmental law. Hammurabi's code also reflects a deep concern for land and resources, principles that are echoed in today's environmental law. While Hammurabi's concerns were more about maintaining agricultural stability and ensuring fair trade, modern legal systems are increasingly concerned with the sustainability of our planet. Climate change has become one of the most pressing global issues, and the need for international agreements and enforceable laws that address environmental concerns is more urgent than ever. Hammurabi's approach of codifying laws to ensure social stability and protecting the resources of society can be seen in international environmental agreements and national policies aimed at reducing carbon emissions, protecting biodiversity, and ensuring fair distribution of resources. Artificial intelligence and automation. The rise of artificial intelligence and automation is another area where Hammurabi's early legal framework can still offer valuable insights. Hammurabi's laws were designed to govern the everyday interactions of society, from trade to marriage, and even the roles of workers in the economy. Today, the question is how we regulate machines, algorithms, and AI systems that are making decisions traditionally made by humans. Just as Hammurabi's laws sought to ensure fairness and accountability in trade, similar principles must be applied to ensure ethical standards and accountability in the development and implementation of AI. Hammurabi's idea that laws must be codified and clear can serve as a foundation for creating transparent and accountable regulations for these rapidly evolving technologies.